Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the CHK Center for Bioethics 10th Anniversary Celebration Seminar Series. Dementia, Advanced Directives, and Oral Feeding. What does respect for patients permit? What does it require? I'm Joey, your Master of Ceremonies for today's event. Thank you all for being here today, both in person and online through Zoom. We are grateful for your presence. And we are honored to have esteemed speakers and guests with us today. To begin, we have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Roger Chong, our Center Co-Director, to give us welcoming remarks. Professor Chong, please.
Now, I'm not going on shopping over here, but this bag over here, you can definitely take it for your shopping. It's very tough, it's robust, it's very well designed. And we thank our center staff and especially Anne, our co-director, for making this happen. And within it, there are a couple of things. We have our center booklet, which actually was drafted by our staff, and also listed over here is really the mission, vision of our center, and also looking back the 10 years, because now is the 10th anniversary this year, 2025. So the 10 years achievements of our center, and how do we want our center to be seen in the future. So this is a very important book to understand our center, and also some souvenirs for everyone. We have some very lovely, what do you call this? Yes. For cups and coffee mugs and all that. So make sure that on your way out, please take one bag with you, or you can take more. We have a lot. Okay. So I'm Professor Roger Chung, co-director for the Center for Bioethics, also with Ann Lau. Good morning, everyone. Welcome here again to the seminar on the Dementia Advanced Directive and Oral Feeding. What does respect for patients permit? What does it require? And I'm very delighted to extend a very warm welcome to every one of you, especially those who show up here today in person, and also the people who also came online to this seminar. It's really my distinguished pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Paul Menzel, and also discussant, Professor Timothy Kwok. Professor Menzel is an eminent scholar in the fields of bioethics, philosophy, and health policy, with a particular focus on moral questions in healthcare economics and end-of-life decision-making. He taught philosophy at Pacific Lutheran University from 1971 to 2012, where he not only shaped the academic discourse in biomedical ethics and human rights, but also played a significant role in administrative leadership, including serving as the provost. Over the years, his scholarship has produced several influential books, numerous articles examining critical topics such as healthcare rationing, the balance between treatment and prevention, and the ethical complexities of advanced medical directives. Beyond academia, Professor Menzel has been deeply engaged in broader ethical and policy discussions on aging and end-of-life care. He is a respected voice in debates on voluntarily stopping eating and drinking for patients with dementia, a subject at the heart of today's seminar too. His commitment to respecting patient autonomy and dignity has made his work highly relevant to both theoretical bioethics and practical healthcare policy. Today, he will address some of the most ethically challenging questions in contemporary healthcare. How should we respect advanced directives for dementia patients? What moral considerations come into play when oral feeding becomes an issue? And how do we balance autonomy, dignity, and care in these difficult decisions? Professor Timothy Kwok, the discussant for today's seminar, graduated from University of Leicester in the UK and received specialist training in geriatric and internal medicine in St. George's Hospital in London before returning to Hong Kong to join the Department of Medicine and Therapeutics in the Chinese University of Hong Kong in 1994. He obtained his MD in 2004 was promoted to professorship in 2006 and was endowed the SC Ho Professorship in 2022. At CUHK, Professor Kwok is the director of Jockey Club Center for Positive Aging, a comprehensive care center for people with dementia, and also Jockey Club Center for Osteoporosis Care and Control. His research interests include Alzheimer's disease, dementia care, B vitamins for brain health, osteoporosis, falls, nutrition in older people, etc. He served in the guardianship board for several years also. Now please join me in welcoming Professor Paul Menzel to deliver his seminar. Professor Menzel, please. The floor is yours.
Can you hear me? I want to thank very much both Roger.
Closer.
Both Roger. Is it louder?
Just.
There we go. Both Roger and Ann, and of course also Joey, who gave us so much help coming here, and Han Lam Lee, who was instrumental in us coming here in 2015, which is one of the predecessors of us being invited now, and also Edgar Cheng, who is one of the most pleasant and inquisitive persons I have ever known in my life. The topic today is one that I must remain somewhat humble about, because I have strong feelings about what the good arguments and the bad arguments are on this topic. And sometimes that leads me to, I think, violate a bit the Confucian virtue of humility. But also the Confucian virtue of respect is the central claim, moral claim, really, at the end of the paper you'll see. And therefore, I feel welcomed in a way by Confucian, and instructed a bit too on the humility score, making arguments. Just briefly, here is what I'm going to deal with. Demographics, that is, people with advanced dementia in Hong Kong and China, and compared to the US. The limited number, very limited number of ways to avoid living into advanced dementia, and I will argue that advanced directives are crucial for that. The very frequent flawed directives that you see when you look up dementia directives in the Western literature, at least, the sites where they would post sample directives, almost all of them are badly flawed. And I've been working with a group for a much stronger one. Major objections to implementing even the best advanced directive to limit oral feeding, oral food and drink. The refutation of those objections against even the strongest, if one has the strongest kind of advanced directive, there are still strong objections, but I will argue that those objections can be rather definitively refuted. That an important option for that directive is minimum comfort feeding, and I'll explain what that is and the importance of that option. Is adherence ethically permitted, or is it in some very clear cases even required? And I will argue that in the very clearest cases, it's required. And finally, some comment on the status of these arguments in China and Hong Kong, and here my knowledge is very limited, and I will cite the particular sources on the basis of which I make my observations. Prevalence of progressive dementia. Currently in the US, it's 1.6% of the population. In China, in a 2022 figure, it's 1.1%, somewhat lower. That It might not actually be lower, but that's what studies show it to be. Deaths from dementia, not just deaths of people with dementia, very important distinction. Number in the United States in 2021, 300,000. That means that more than 300,000 people had severe dementia, because 300,000 people died from dementia, and you do not die from dementia unless you are in advanced dementia, very advanced dementia. So you can extrapolate some data then about, at least in the United States, this is the projection, this is the extrapolation, that in 2024, somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 people had advanced dementia. Because 300,000 people died from dementia, which means they had, and advanced dementia does not generally last just 1 year. It lasts many years. Now, there's a very limited number of ways to avoid living into advanced dementia. Legalized aid in dying is of no use. Terminal illness and current capacity requirements, as in most jurisdictions in the world, prevent that. Now, there are advanced euthanasia directives in the Netherlands, and I would call it a tempered version of it in Canada, but certainly not in other countries. It would be very unusual for legalized aid in dying to be useful for a person to avoid advanced dementia, because when they're competent, when they have capacity, they're not within remotely terminally ill, even in a much longer than 6-month prognosis standard. One could voluntarily stop eating and drinking, but that would have to be early, because you'd have to have the functional and cognitive decision-making capacity to do it. That means you're going to be quite a ways away from advanced dementia when you did it, and we call that preemptive VSED. Preemptive suicide, I know I have one colleague in philosophy who strongly says that's the proper way to avoid the problems. It doesn't avoid the problems. One is bound to make suspicions by prosecutors, whoever else, that the family helped with this, and then they're culpable of assisting suicide. It can be risky in result because it can backfire, not end the life, but end with worse damage. Finally, stopping eating and drinking by advance directive. Yes, in principle, I'll argue this can work, but it's problematic unless done in a very complete and careful way, and that's what I'll go through. Then it is ethically justified and clinically doable. The advance directive for stopping eating and drinking. There's the basic argument. The same VSED has the right to VSED is based on the same grounds that refusing life-saving treatment is, namely the right of informed consent, or actually better phrased for purposes of this discussion, the right of informed refusal, based on, in American and British legal terms, bodily integrity. I would actually phrase it somewhat different, but not bodily integrity, but that's a legal detail. The reason it's based, that the right of informed refusal yields a right to voluntarily stop eating and drinking, is the only way you can force a person to eat, if they're really determined not to eat, is by feeding tubes or artificial hydration and nutrition. And that's medical treatment, and they have the right to refuse that. So they do have the right to refuse food and water, by implication. Now, the foundation of advanced directives is an additional step that one needs to put in, One does not lose one's rights with loss of capacity. Those rights just have to be exercised for you by someone else. In the United States, the famous Cruzan decision by the Supreme Court said you do not lose your rights when you lose capacity. They just have to be exercised by somebody else, and if somebody else knows what your views are in refusing life-saving treatment, they can do it. And similarly, that means a right to voluntarily to stop eating and drinking. I will refer to this, sometimes it's called voluntarily stopping eating and drinking by advance directive, but other people like the term advance directive for stopping eating and drinking, because by the time you get there and have lost capacity, there's a question about whether it's really voluntary. Lawyers tend to say, oh, it's still voluntary because it was voluntary when you made the directive, and therefore it's voluntary now. That's a quibble about language. That said, advance directives for stopping eating and drinking are frequently very weak. I'll explain that later. Now, one example of a weak directive, somewhat tragically for her and her children, is Margot Bentley. This is a widely publicized case in British Columbia. For those of you who don't have a picture of what truly advanced dementia is like, the picture on the left is Margot Bentley in 2011, and the picture of her 5 years later, the year she died, is the one on the right. These are gruesome to look at. If one has not been with a person in advanced dementia, not all people in advanced directive, our view of them is not as disturbing as dementia, as Margot here, but I've had firsthand contact with people in advanced dementia, and in the advanced stages, my late mother-in-law, the mother of my late wife, for example, would coo when you stroked her arm, and she would look at you and get a bit of a smile if you stroked her arm and said, "I love you." And that was the limit of her engagement, period. It was extremely disturbing for her grandchildren to visit her. Sorry, in one case it was great-grandchildren. They were the ones that, they had great difficulty with this. In other cases, people have no difficulty whatsoever. Now notice, they all called her Jerry, even when she was in advanced dementia, and it was doubtful she recognized them as the individuals they were. They didn't say she was a different person. She was Jerry, great-grandma Jerry. Now, Margot Bentley died that year, the second picture. She was 12 years in dementia, 4 in the most severe stage. She had been caring for people in dementia as a former nurse. She had an advance directive refusing food and water as early as 1993. That's 23 years before she died. It was reiterated more recently, but it was flawed because it said only no food and fluids without explicitly saying no oral food and fluids. When her children, when her daughter particularly, who was heading up the conveying of her wishes to the caregivers, tried to get her advance directive enforced, and it went to court, and the court said that because she still swallowed food, she could be coaxed to swallow food. That was a choice and constituted voluntary acceptance within the law, and therefore she couldn't be refused food and water. There was a similar case in Oregon that also got a lot of publicity, and in the same way, she had a very weak advance directive not making clear that it was oral food and water that she was refusing. Now, the critical issues that must be addressed in any good advance directive for stopping eating and drinking is what is to be withheld. It has to be oral food and drink. It has to include that. When that should be withheld, I'll call those the triggering conditions. When I don't recognize others, when I don't do this, when I don't do this, etc. The extent of palliative measures to be used to keep me comfortable when food and water are limited, it's very important, including whether or not what's called, at least in the US, proportionate palliative sedation should be used. That's not sedation to unconsciousness. It's whatever amount of sedation is necessary to relieve the distress. Finally, if the triggering conditions are met, but the person seems happy, and the agent believes the person's agent believes quality of life is sufficient, what should be done? The directive still followed or not? That needs to be addressed in the directive. What if clinicians of the facility refuse to implement the directive? What should then be done? Taken home and person's directive then followed, or what? And finally, most importantly, what if the person expresses a desire to eat and drink by going, That's a desire, it's an expression of a desire to eat or drink. Should water and food and water still be withheld? Or should some be given? And here's where minimum comfort feeding comes in, I will argue, to sort of save the day. But we'll get to that later. Now, dementia directives, the phrase dementia directives are all over the place in US end of life care. You can find umpteen sites. This is awfully fine link, but the ones below the line, the 8 very prominent published, posted directives, are hugely flawed in one way or the other, sometimes, many of them in multiple ways. They don't address what to do if the person expresses a desire to eat or drink, for example, or if the facility refuses to implement it, or they say nothing about the extent of palliative care. Those are very common ones. Or they don't even mention oral food and drink. The top one, which is at a group called Washington Law Help, which puts legal forms up so people can avoid higher expenses with attorneys. People can do some of it themselves. And they have posted the directive that a group that I've been working with refined to overcome the weaknesses of the other published advanced directives. Specific strengths of this directive are that the triggering conditions are not described exclusively in terms of sufficient suffering, but also by kinds of unacceptable deterioration. Both that and advanced directives, by the way, are the subject of the New York Times article in the international edition just 2 days ago in the New York Times in the US a week. It's about advanced directives for euthanasia, but many of the same issues arise. And in the Netherlands, the only eligibility condition for euthanasia is unbearable suffering. But when the person gets to advanced directive, if they're content, advanced dementia, they may not appear by all appearances, they're not suffering. They're just unengaged. And the triggering condition should be described as either sufficient suffering or unacceptable deterioration, and then the directive should define that by the triggering conditions. This new directive does that. It provides an option for palliative sedation, and it provides direction if the person wants to be fed. What should be done? Continue to withhold all food and drink, or, and I'll get to this option later, move to minimal comfort feeding. Finally, what to do if the facility or clinician refuses to implement. Now, if all these are present, as they are in the new directive, I would argue that there's a persuasive defense of the ethical permissibility, not necessarily the requirement, get to that later, to implement the directive that as clinicians and family are not doing something wrong if they implement the directive. There are major objections to this. I'll go through them in more detail in a bit, but quickly. Well, it's a different person. The person when they made the directive was aware of the directive, yada, yada, yada. The person in advanced dementia doesn't even know they had a directive. In fact, psychologically, they're not very similar to the person who wrote the directive at all. It's a different person. Secondly, change of mind. They've just had a change of mind when they want to eat now, still, after the triggering conditions have been met. Thirdly, the famous or infamous then self, now self problem. The current patient wants something at odds with the advanced directive, like food, and clinicians and agents usually feel obligated to satisfy the patient's current desires because they're suffering right in front of them if those desires aren't met. That's a very strong moral appeal. And anybody who thinks that, oh, clinicians should just follow the advanced directive without paying attention to that current desire to eat, I think doesn't understand compassionate care in a clinical setting. So I take this problem very seriously, even if I think it can be solved. Refutations of this. First, the different person argument is, I think, the easiest to refute, or one of the easiest. Insufficient psychological connectedness is the basis of the objection. But here's an example that I think pretty clearly refutes this different person claim. Take Charles. When he wrote the directive, somebody will say, he wasn't the same person as the patient as Charles is now, the person before us. There's no identity of person through a life, and the philosophical view behind this is Derek Parfit's famous dissection of the notion of personal identity, which you might take to be a skeptical one about whether we really know what identity of person through life is at all. However, I would argue there are extremely unacceptable everyday implications of this different person view. For example, if it were true, if the view were true, we would think Charles at 60 to be a different person than Charles at 3, because Charles at 3 doesn't know anything about Charles at 60, really. And Charles at 60 can't remember anything that I can't remember anything before I was 4. So there's no memory connection there. So we'd say, well, Charles at 3 is a different person than Charles at 60. Well, clearly we don't. Secondly, we would hold, if this view were true, either we would have 2 memorials, one for then Charles, when Charles dies, and one for the demented Charles, if it were 2 people, different people. Or we would have one memorial when Charles went into advanced dementia, and another memorial when Charles actually died. Furthermore, when we were visiting Charles, Uncle Charles, in his advanced dementia, we wouldn't think we were visiting Uncle Charles. But the reason we visit the person is because he is Uncle Charles. So, although I don't think linguistic use and actual behavior of people always should dictate a philosophical view, I think here it should dictate an ethical conclusion that the different person objection to advanced directives is bankrupt and ought to be dismissed. Maybe there are extreme cases where. Second objection. Change of mind. An expression of desire to eat, for example, conflicts with the person's advanced directive, for sure. But the the expression does not constitute what lawyers would call a revocation, because to revoke a directive, you have to understand what you're revoking, and the person clearly doesn't understand that. However, that expression does seem to constitute some sort of change of mind. But my question is it of the relevant sort? It involves nothing like the mental activity informing the preferences stated in the directive. So is it a change of one's mind? Well, it's a different mind of sorts, but it's not a different person. But is it a relevant change of mind? Person that Bonnie and I are very fond of quoting on this matter, Ronald Bergman said, at the time you would most likely change your mind, that is when you're getting into advanced dementia, you don't have enough of a mind to change. So the person hasn't really changed their mind. Now, refutations, then self, now self. Dworkin's, a famous philosopher, his solution is that critical interests have priority over experiential ones. The expression of a desire to eat and drink when you start to withhold food and water is an experiential interest. It's an interest, all right, but it's an experiential and relatively momentary one, even though if it can happen repeatedly the next day, for example. Critical interests are judgments and interests they're based on judgments and evaluations one makes about one's larger life, the person one wants to be, keeping one's promises, having children, treating them in the right way, hoping that they treat their children in the right way, et cetera, et cetera. They are more reflective, and they usually are about larger aspects of a life, not just momentary need. I reject that view in general as one in which Dworkin's view is that critical interests always trump experiential interests in every case. And I think there are counterexamples to that, but I won't go into that. I think a stronger argument in refuting the then self, now self objection is that one's life is one's own. Now, we don't often formalize this. It is so subconscious. We just assume. We talk about my life. Well, wait a minute. Do I own my life? Well, nobody else owns it. It's not somebody else's life, and it's not no one's life. It's mine. Does mine mean I own it? Well, nobody else owns it. And it's not the case that no one owns it. Unless, of course, you're of the view that God owns my life, for example, in some views, and I don't. But how many people really believe that they don't own their life? Even if God, in some sense, is a co-owner, I'm also a co-owner. I'm an owner. Now, when life has larger aspects, like how the life would best end, and those hopes or values are not satisfied, that is a damage, that is a harm to one's life. Take, for example, going to a memorial in which one's reputation is demeaned. Has your life been damaged? You're not here to hear it, but your life has been damaged. There's a philosopher who's written a very persuasive argument on posthumous harm, using that as an example. Similarly, if your advance directive to withhold food and water is not followed and you end up living 6 years into advanced dementia when you said that was not the way you wanted your life to end, your life has been harmed. And if you think it doesn't make a difference, go to a memorial for a person whose life ended in 6 or 8 years of advanced dementia. I've been at them. It is a different memorial. Palpably, viscerally different memorial. Now, finally, even now, the person before us is the person who wrote the directive. They're not a different person. They're not aware of their directive, but they are the person who wrote the directive. Nonetheless, and Bonnie and I wrote this on a different case for advanced euthanasia directives 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And this is, there are not yet cases. No matter how clear and complete the advance directive, doubts about its implementation may arise. It may not have been recently written or reiterated. The agent-patient communication about it may have not have been substantial, even if the advance directive itself was perfect. But it's the agent who now has to make sure it's carried out. And if you haven't had conversation with the agent and they don't really understand what you meant in the directive or how determined you were, That's a weakness in the directive. Even with the triggering conditions met and clearly stated, the patient may seem to have an interest in living more than just desiring food. They may evidence a real happiness, though they don't recognize you, and you said when they don't recognize you, stop their food and water. They may not recognize you, so that triggering condition has been met, but they seem happy to see you. Or whoever walks into the room that morning. Do they not have an interest in living? I think they do. Not just an interest in being fed, they have an interest in living. They haven't yet gotten to the point where they don't have an interest in living. When they can't expect tomorrow, be happy about something that in a minimal way they expected. Or remember yesterday when they get to it. Remember yesterday when they get to the tomorrow. Then they may not have an interest in living, only an interest in being fed, which may not be substantial enough. But those create the cases where Bonnie and I said then, just wait. Don't forget the directives. Pay attention to their directive. It's very important. Just don't administer it yet. And I think lawyers object to that sometimes, but I defend it. Finally, minimum comfort feeding. Minimum comfort feeding this example, I'll go through it extremely quickly. Gladys, this example used in the paper written on this subject, is in long-term care, fast stage 7A, advanced dementia. She's incontinent, says a few words including I love you and help me. She sleeps 18 to 20 hours a day and her appetite is waning. Her brother visits weekly. He promised her that he would implement her advanced directive, which said to withhold food and water, just withhold it, period. And the triggering conditions are now met. She will open her mouth and swallow and carefully spoon-fed, assiduously spoon-fed, day after day, week after week, month after month, by clinical assistants who believe it is their compassionate duty to feed, not to follow her directive to withhold all food and water. Now, Hope Wetchkin and colleagues who published this paper said there's a great range in comfort feeding. Maximum comfort feeding is don't feed more than is comfortable. Minimal comfort feeding is only feed what is necessary to relieve distress when you start withholding food and water. And it turns out, when this is actually done, and Hope Wetchkin has seen numerous patients in her hospice where this has been done, and there's another party in Seattle that's done the same thing. How long does a person live? Their appetite is waning anyhow. It doesn't take much food to assuage their desire at all. And they die within 4, 5, 6 weeks. It isn't even months, much less years, and a person in maximum comfort feeding can live for years. So has the person's desire not to live much into advanced dementia been mostly accomplished by minimum comfort feeding compared to implementing their directive strictly? Yes. Therefore, it's a good out. And the directive that I've noted, and Northwest Sussex Contact Directive, speaks directly to this issue. And in this case, you can see it would be appropriate for Gladys to get it. Now, the interesting thing is, in actually doing minimum comfort feeding, Hope Wetchkin doesn't even schedule the meals. They wait for the person to say they want to be fed or to express a desire, and then they take them to the meal. Now, the staff has to say, okay, I'll feed them at 2 a.m. instead of 6 p.m. They didn't want it to be fed at 6 p.m. And it takes some flexibility in the staff, but they actually almost none of the patients in this situation want to eat more than once a day, and only a very minimal amount. How much less respectful of the patient in minimum comfort feeding is minimum comfort feeding than full withholding? I would say not less respectful really at all. The fundamental respect is they're not going to live long into advanced dementia, and that's a compliment. Big advantage, it simply avoids the then self, now self problem because the person's desires are satisfied. There is no then self, now self problem. The then self of the directive and the now self wanting to be fed just disappears. Huge ethical advantage. Ethically permitted or required, I won't go through this detail except that in the very clearest cases, I think it is required, but those would have to be extremely clear cases. Otherwise, I say it's only ethically permitted, and you need a lot of coordination between the agent and clinicians, and they're not violating their obligation necessarily by not implementing, or at least not implementing yet. But they at least ought to implement with minimum comfort feeding, especially if that's in the directive. That's required. That's where we get into the required cases. Now, Chinese law, and I don't, Dr. Kwok will know much more about this. There are two parts here of Chinese law. 2019 law of the People's Republic of China on basic health care. You can read it here. And Article 25 of the 2021 Medical Practitioners Law adds they're required to obtain their explicit consent, even clearer. Additional sources include a 2009 tort law, summary of tort law. However, in actual medical practice, it's definitely the case, I think, that close relatives readily become agents of consent when patients lose capacity more readily than in the United States. They often do in the United States too, but advanced direct appointed surrogates are used less often, although they're not used all that often in the United States either. So there's less difference here between the US and China than people often think. Finally, a study, and there are two studies involved, and I may have mixed up the footnotes here, of young Chinese doctor decisions of unconscious patients where families often have the prerogative of refusing recommended life-saving treatments. The doctor recommends a life-saving treatment, the family refuses. Now, in 5% of these cases, the doctors would override the family refusal, although the very same patient beforehand, when asked about this prospective situation, had said, override my family and give me the life-saving treatment. Very interesting fact. Now, what did they feel about this? Another study revealed that young physicians, pay extra attention to informing the patient's family, even when they, the clinicians, think that it is not in the patient's best interest to inform the family because of conflicts that will arise in what they wanted done. 70% chose to comply with the family request to withhold information from the patient. But of those 70% who chose to comply, many felt distress in doing so, believing that it was not only violation of their professional ethics, but also a violation of the relevant laws, to tell the family information when the patient didn't want the family to be told. So there's a lot of variety in actual practice here, I think. Now, I may be misinterpreting Advanced directives, I won't go through this detail, but advanced directives do have a place in at least Hong Kong law, especially because of the health authorities guidelines in 2019. And to be sure, there's some details in that directive about palliative care, but life-sustaining treatment other than basic and palliative care should not be governed by advanced directives, and yet the advanced directive for withholding food and water that held up as the model directive assumes that palliative care would be given. Why would a person even want a directive for this if palliative care weren't given? So they don't have to write an advanced directive for palliative care. Finally, is it basic care? Well, we can have a long argument about that, but it's so assiduously and carefully given. It's an art to feed a person this way, day after day, week after week, when they don't want to eat. Finally, there are model forms put out by the Hong Kong Law Reform Commission in 2020. The last of the cases does not require terminal illness or irreversible coma. It's for other last end stage, irreversible life-limiting conditions, and advanced dementia is clearly one of those. So I think advanced directives for withholding food and water stand on pretty sound ground, even in Hong Kong. I could be wrong about that. I'm certainly not a lawyer, much less a Hong Kong lawyer. Concluding observations, comprehensive advanced directive for withholding food and water and drink in advanced dementia stand on solid ethical and legal ground. Objections based on different person, change of mind, then self, now self fail, especially if minimum comfort feeding is noted in the directive as an option. And in the very clearest cases, agents and clinicians are obligated to implement those. And that finally, such directives do have a basis in Chinese and Hong Kong law. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Manso, for your inspiring seminar. So now let's move into the discussion and Q&A session. May I now pass the time to Professor Timothy Kwok for him to share his insights. Professor Kwok, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Manso, for a very insightful talk, and that has inspired me to have further deliberation on this topic. In the interest of time, I just want to go over the current situation in Hong Kong very briefly, and then I'll will comment on a few points on your presentation. So in fact, when I accepted the invitation to join this seminar, I was thinking in terms of tube feeding rather than oral feeding. So that's reflected on the topic, sort of the first slide of my PowerPoint. So when I sort of approach this problem, I'm just thinking about tube feeding all the time, because this is the more relevant, so pertinent issue in my clinical practice in geriatric medicine. But I think what you are saying is a step further. Is not just not having tube feeding, but not having any feeding at all. So this is a difference, and this, yeah. But nevertheless, I kept this title. Let's see. Now, the current situation is that a lot of frail elderly people are coming into hospitals, public-funded hospitals, because they're sort of, well, there are many reasons. One of them is that lack of primary medical support in the community as well as in the nursing homes. The second would be that it's a big deal to die in a community. They are all regarded as coroner's case. So we've only recently passed legislation that allowed people to die in the nursing homes if they are seen by doctors within 2 weeks of death. So previous to that, there was some misunderstanding and sort of a worry about people dying anywhere outside hospital. So everyone is motivated to move dying people into the hospital. And that creates problems for us, people who work in hospital. Every day we're faced with ethical dilemma, treat or not treat, and how much we treat. Whereas if, I was trained in the UK and there was no such problem because all these people are managed in nursing homes and they would not go anywhere near a hospital when they deteriorate. Okay? But in Hong Kong, you just call 999 and they come to hospitals. And when they come to hospital, we have a lot of resources to support their lives. We have very powerful antibiotics and, short from ventilation, there are many ways that we can keep them alive. And I'm an expert on that. Geriatricians, we are trained to look after people who are very frail and very good, and we're very good at it. And, defensive medicine is a strong word, but generally speaking, we loathe to go against the families because of risk management. But that's, part of the course. The problem, these are the features of people with severe dementia. They're mentally incapable, they're very dependent, and, it's difficult to, impossible to assess the quality of life. And also, life expectancy is very difficult to judge. Clinically, we can use nutritional status if you want to be scientific. But still, there are a lot of room for error. So, with this emphasis of terminally ill, it's difficult to decide whether severe people with advanced dementia are really terminally ill. So we usually use malnutrition as a marker of imminent death. And also swallowing difficulty is the final event and aspiration pneumonia. So in the hospital setting, we usually refer to the speech therapist, and the speech therapist will inevitably say that they are not fit for oral feeding and will do the tube feeding. So as a result, a lot of people have tube feeding, and if you go to nursing homes, is a common sight. So to us, this is creating a lot of suffering for people with dementia. That's why we are so focused on this issue of tube feeding. So there's an example of a person in an OH home who are constantly restrained for more than 2 or 3 years then. And she looked quite well nourished. That's because she had been fed for over 2 or 3 years. Before that, she was near death. But with this intervention, she was kept alive, but very unhappily. Every day she was moving around, trying to get rid of the tube that she could not ever remove. We did a last study in Hong Kong to survey the older people in nursing homes to sample their view on end-of-life issues. Well, we didn't ask about oral feeding. We asked about tube feeding, resuscitation, things like that. In fact, it was not easy to find participants because, they had to be mentally capable to answer questionnaires like that. So, I would say 10 to 20% of nursing home residents were able to answer our questions. Based on those people, you can say the majority of them would not like to be kept alive with life-sustaining treatment, including tube feeding. and 1/3 prefer to die in the nursing homes. But that is, normal people, and also is not 100%. So there are some people who want to be kept alive, you could say. And then I did another study to look at the family caregivers' attitude towards tube feeding in the nursing home settings in people with severe dementia, and asked the question when they became critically ill or have irreversible coma, what do you think about tube feeding? And before anything, just 80% said they would want life-sustaining treatment. I'm talking about family attitudes. And even when the person become comatose, nearly 60% of families wanted something done. And after some explanation of poor prognosis in these scenarios, the percentage came down significantly, but still quite significant. Significant proportion wanted treatment. Paul mentioned about hospital authorities' initiative in thinking about advanced directive, and so in fact they've been thinking about that for a long time, 15 years, and Derek, they are the ones who are instrumental in this in the audience, but then sort of when you look at the current, the latest version, they are applicable to specific life-sustaining treatments when the person is mentally incapable and terminally ill or in vegetative state. So very strict, well, in comparison to what Paul is suggesting. But we do have allowance of end-stage irreversible life limiting condition, so that would include severe dementia. And the life-sustaining treatment include resuscitation, ventilation, pacemakers, and include tube feeding, but does not include oral feeding. But of course, if the person really wanted to withhold oral feeding, they can say so. Okay, it's an open, it's a line, is a section for them to fill in. But these are the examples that we anticipate people to say. And the offer of oral nutrition and hydration is regarded as part of basic care. In recent editions, they have included these options for people to take. Okay, so I've just copy and paste for your information. Save for basic and palliative care, I shall not be given any life-sustaining treatment. I don't understand this statement because I don't know what is this scenario that I shall not be given any self-sustaining treatment except basic care. Most people get basic care, so when would it be withheld? And another option is, however, I want to continue to receive artificial nutrition and hydration if clinically indicated, unless death is imminent or inevitable. So this is an option for people to take. It is challenging to make any advance directive before dementia. Because it is a long gap between normality and severe dementia. And the major worry, theoretical worry, is that people with dementia, when they become demented, they cannot revoke the advance directive. And people think about different scenarios that they might benefit from treatment in the interim. That hence the different boxes that people want to take. And more importantly is that by nature of neurodegeneration, you really have to do it very early, because when you have some cognitive impairment, you do not have the insight, you do not have the foresight, or at least it can be argued that they do not have the mental capacity to think so much far ahead. And also psychologically, people are in a state of denial. Even accepting the diagnosis of dementia is difficult in early phase. So there's raises question of mental capacity. Advanced care planning is something that we try to push for in the last few years or 10 years or so among our hospital patients. So we discuss with the family about the options of comfort hand feeding or tube feeding. Okay, and in some cases we are successful and we can achieve palliative care, so to speak. And in my hospital, we give them the reassurance that if the family cannot manage, they can always send the patients back to us. We have a couple of dementia feeding wards specifically for this purpose. Mind you, it is comfort hand feeding, not minimal comfort feeding that we were talking about. Okay, so let's come to my reflection on the points made by Professor Menzel. I think the first impression I've got is that, it's about oral feeding, not tube feeding. And there are really some people who really do not want to live in the state of severe dementia. To me, it is a revelation because we've always assumed that people want to live and our job is to help people to live as much as possible. So I see it my business to help people to continue living in a quality, with quality and dignity. But having said that, what I'm doing might not be what some patients might want. They really want to die. They don't want to continue. But we try our best to help people to continue. You can see the dilemma. But then I think that might be the crux of the problem. The reason why we have so much tube feeding and all is that I think the Dr. Menzel's point about my life is mine. What is a life? What is your life? And I think that's the most basic. Is our life really just our lives? Sometimes we might want to live for other people. If my daughter wants me to be alive and she wants to look after me, I would not refuse. You might say that that's a Chinese way of thinking, but I'm sure it might be a common human attitude. But then there are some people who really want to die, and no matter what, I think. But there is what I'm saying, that there are variation in this attitude, and also okay. And then when you, in fact, okay. Yeah. Okay. So another point is that the terminally ill patients, when you think about refusal to eat, is an unusual situation in clinical practice. Or there are some people who would choose not to eat in order to die, but they are the exception. Most people would accept some feeding even when they don't want to live. But then if if in the advance directive, they explicitly say that they don't want to be fed, and that's fair enough. But generally speaking, when we are managing normal people, we assume that they want to eat or they would accept eating. And that's part of the basic care. Okay. And yeah. The second point is that if advance directive includes all self-sustaining treatment, interventions are not, which are not usually considered very burdensome, should not be given. Okay, so this is a matter of judgment. So our concept is that when the treatment is very burdensome, then we will withhold the intervention. But what Paul is suggesting is that even if it is not burdensome, we should still withhold if it is life-sustaining. Okay, this is a big difference. So in medical practice, we very often give treatment like oral antibiotics or or drug for hypertension, drugs for diabetes. You can consider these as life-sustaining. So where do you make the distinction? So that for clinicians, this is a gray area we have to decide, even when there is advance directive. Assisted feeding may be considered medical treatment rather than basic care. I have some difficulty in accepting that because assisted feeding is certainly time-consuming and requires some skill, but in reality, a lot of informal carers can do it. A lot of family carers can do it. Comfort feeding, I didn't get the point about minimal comfort feeding. I just thought about comfort hand feeding. But then when we look at the people who are doing the hand feeding at home or even in a hospital, I can see that some of the comfort feeding is not comfortable. People go into extreme lengths to get the food down. I've seen people who use the spoon to wriggle the throat in order to stimulate the swallowing, to keep people alive. Okay, so I think we should be more aware of this problem. And to me, I would not want to be fed like this. I would rather have a tube than to be enforced to eat like that. A very important point is that advance directive made before dementia is valid, even when the person with dementia will become mentally incapable to revoke it later. This is a very important point, and that helps us to be more proactive about helping people to make advance directive against the scenario of advanced dementia among normal older people. At the moment, we are worried about the validity, and that's why we're not doing it, because we don't think they'll be honored anyway. But I think we have some, ethical foundation to do that. But still, the practical issues will remain when families, so it's very important for the families to be involved, to know that the person really do not want to live like this. And in order to get it honored, I think the family needs to be very well informed. The wishes of the person before dementia should be respected more than their parent wish. This is also a very important point in terms of in honoring the advance directive. But having said that, I make the point that it is no doubt that the personhood of people with dementia is diminished. But in clinical practice, we rely quite a lot on the response body response, behavioral responses from person with dementia. Because if, we don't really, because we are not certain what people want. According to my survey, a lot of old people do not want to be kept alive. It's true, but some of them wanted to be kept alive. So there's uncertainty. So based on this uncertainty, we can only assume that people want to live. But then when their body language is against tube feeding, is against oral feeding, against this and that, we would honor it. So it is something that can guide our clinical management. So this body, we know that ethically, it has a lower priority than the experiential wish, that's interest that we talk about, because that is at a higher level of thinking and cognitive function. But so it is more respected, so to speak. But having said that, I think the more primitive responses should be respected too. So we have people who are force-fed, really, clearly against their wish. They're struggling. One of my patients, she struggles so much, the face got blown up, all reddened with red spots, petechia. The small vessels have burst because she resisted so much. So you could say that, oh, she has no mental capacity to refuse. But I would argue that she has refused. Okay? So body language, behavioral responses is also important. So to conclude, most old people accept death and would like to have a peaceful exit. Chinese people, even among those families, even among those with severe dementia, are often not prepared to forego life-sustaining interventions when the time comes. Advanced care planning may help people to promote, palliative care in people with severe dementia. Advanced directives may be useful to protect people with severe dementia from burdensome interventions, such as tube feeding. But in some cases, even for non-burdensome interventions as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kwok. Now we'll move into the discussion Q&A session. So for Zoom participants, please feel free to use the few Q&A features on Zoom to submit your questions. So any questions from the audience?
Yes, before my question, a point for clarification. Since November last year, Advanced Directive in Hong Kong is no longer under common law. It's under statute law because we have legislated for AMD in Hong Kong. And I think with that, yes, the implementation will be in 18 months. So in 2026, we will actually implement the law. And by that time, we cannot really say that there's still basis for consideration of what Professor Menso is talking about. In common law, perhaps we can still argue there's basis, but once it's statute law, we can only go within the confine of the statutes, and that does not include oral feeding in the advanced directive. Okay? It includes severe dementia, life-sustaining treatments, tube feeding, and everything else, but not complete feeding. So that's a point of clarification. The question which is really for Professor Kwok rather than Paul. I don't hear from Professor Kwok a direct response to what you actually think about the point being made by Professor Menso that legally and ethically it is not only acceptable, but perhaps a requirement to respect those minority of people who really don't want to have oral feeding. And if they have an advanced directive, shouldn't that be respected? So that seems to be a question that's beyond the general cultural reading or the situation in Hong Kong or China or anywhere.
Yeah, I agree. If the advance directive is clear about this, then we should not even feed them.
As a clinician actually practicing, I'm pleased and reassured and even inspired by that. But how difficult is it for you, given all the other things in both your practice, not just the cultural context?
It will be very difficult.
Is it for you to follow an advance directive that's very, very clear?
It will be very difficult. And minimal comfort feeding may be the compromise.
Yes, okay. Well,
that might be acceptable to the family.
and you think minimum comfort feeding can work?
In some families.
In
Yeah.
some- And what would you do if the
so the
families-
dilemma is that, if it is legally binding, then we have to go against the family's wish.
And you would?
I suppose so.
I admire you very much.
Just a follow-up on that. There is a clarification. The law, the ordinance that has been passed, specifically states that basic care cannot be refused in the Advanced Medical Directive. And basic care include the offer of oral food and fluid. However, this does not say the extent of this offer of oral food and fluid. So, on one hand, I would say that you cannot have signed an advance directive refusing oral food and fluid. That is definitely not a legal option. But let me continue first. Even if that is signed, that won't be a legally binding thing. However, if you take approach from an wish or advanced care planning non-legal approach, what I mean is that you express your value, your priority. In that case, if the family and the clinician thinks that minimal comfort feeding is suitable in that situation, I do not think that it will be something illegal. I don't think it is something not. I don't think it will be something illegal. But of course, whether that is acceptable to the community, acceptable to the culture, acceptable to the family or to the professional, then that is a different issue. I just want to say that legally, you cannot refuse the offer of oral feeding and fluid. However, the degree of the offer and of the food and fluid is subject to discussion.
That's very interesting and very helpful, Dr. Chan. I don't think any advance directive to withhold or limit. Withhold or limit. I don't think any advance directive to withhold or limit oral feeding should ever say, "Don't offer me oral food."
That is what I'm saying. That would not be acceptable in the Hong Kong law.
If basic care includes always offering food, I'm fine with that. But then the question is, should it be given, and here's where I think the artful assisted oral feeding really is treatment, not just basic care of offering. It's difficult to feed a person successfully in advanced dementia. I've seen it done, and I marvel at the art. I saw it done in one case, my late mother-in-law's. I marvel at the facility of the people doing this. It would take me many months of doing it to be as artful and successful in doing it as the people I saw doing it with my late mother-in-law. So that's why I say, even if it's not by a medical professional, it's not basic care.
I have a question for Professor Kwok, and then I have a friendly suggestion to Professor Menzel. You seemed a little bit hesitant about following even a clear advance directive for not having oral feeding in order to live in severe dementia. But would it make a difference to you if the patient, while still in normal mental capacity, did what Paul and I did with our physician, which said, we want an appointment to talk to you about our values and the kinds of things we do and do not wish to have, because we know that if you don't have your doc backing you up, you're likely to have things done to you. So if a patient said to you, here's what I really don't want to happen, and said, I don't want to be given food in order to keep me alive. I don't want to be uncomfortable. I want what palliative care. I want enough food or liquids to keep me comfortable. Would that make it easier for you to follow?
Yes, it would.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And Paul, you said you were talking about minimal comfort feeding, mostly in terms of both amount and timing, like you do it even if it's 2 a.m. and the nursing staff is going, kitchen's, right. But I thought, would not accept this also, that one of the things about minimal comfort feeding is that it is not intended to be of sufficient nutritional value to extend life. So if the person loves vanilla ice cream and you can keep them happy with just a few spoonfuls of vanilla ice cream, you don't say, oh, no, 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 you have to have lentils or something. Right? You accept that.
That's comfort feeding. That's Hope Wetchton and colleagues' whole point in our writing this article. Let me just add one thing before we conclude. There was two major articles a while back, at least my medical colleagues in the U.S. cite frequently. Oh, sorry. I moved the button, but it didn't go on. Major colleagues of mine in the United States, medical colleagues, emphasized two studies that were done earlier that showed that once a person gets to advanced dementia, and they define that very precisely as fast stage 7A or later, tube feeding does not extend life compared to comfort feeding. And therefore, they say, why should we put the patient under the strain of tube feeding? And it is uncomfortable to have the tubes put in and keep them in. We just don't do it. And so it's become just standard practice, standard of care, that in advanced dementia, you don't do tube feeding in the places that know about this research. Now, clearly some places in the US don't know about it either.
Thank you. Thank you. Just two questions. One, just responding to what Professor just mentioned. I was just thinking about the situation in Hong Kong because a lot of the late-stage dementia patients, as Timothy mentioned, were rushed into the hospital. And in Hong Kong, in the hospital setting, people won't have enough time to spend the time to feed the patient. And that's the reason why, or the reasoning of justifying to put into a nasogastric tube for the patient. And because the hospital is just, well, basically the care of the hospital is just relatively free of charge, though the relative demand for that, despite they know that there isn't any survival benefits or maybe a bit even more suffering or complications. So how you address that dilemma? This is the first question. The second question is in responding to one of the ordinance. Sorry, it's Professor Stephen. Well, you mentioned about supposing it's not a dementia patient, but then there is somebody could saying that I do not want to have an oral feeding. I just think of a scenario that, take for example, some of the Protestants demanding for something from the government or not, then they may go to strike and say, I'll go to staff. And yet, many times they rush to the hospital and have all the hydration and whatnot. So, what's the difference between that sort of Protestant who goes to strike, hunger strike, versus that of a cognitively sound person and yet have some diseases that demand, that request not to have given oral feeding?
I'm not sure I understood the question. Were you asking, is the refusal of oral feeding except for minimal comfort feeding the equivalent of going on a hunger strike as a form of protest? Well, I don't see much similarity at all. I mean, people go on hunger strikes because they're trying to make a political point and they're trying to coerce the government or whoever it is to change a policy. In the case of saying that you don't want oral feeding to extend your life, you're saying, I can see what's happening. It's inevitably going on a one-way path. You don't come back from it. And in severe dementia, that kind of life is not to me something I want to live. It's not the way I want my life to end. And therefore, I want to not be forced to eat or, even with lots of things, just give me enough to keep me comfortable so that my life ends in a way that is acceptable to me. Would you agree with that, Paul?
Well, it's an intricate and difficult distinction. And, I haven't seen it discussed, at least I'm not aware of any extensive discussion of the comparative difference, the ethical comparisons in these two kinds of cases. I myself would defend the right of a hunger striker to fast to death. I think they have a right to refuse forced feeding because unless they lose their right to refuse medical life-saving treatment, they have that right. Now you can argue that if they're in prison, for example, and they've already given up their rights, and we can argue about how extensive are the rights that they've given up by their crime that got them in prison, maybe they've lost their right to refuse life-sustaining treatment, in which case, yes, you could force feed them ethically and legally. But that's another longer argument. Have they given up that right? My own view is they haven't given up that right. If I murdered somebody, I haven't given up my right to refuse food. But, of course, I'll lose my life if I refuse food. It's like, is it suicide in prison? Yeah, some people regard voluntary stopping eating and drinking as self-starvation suicide.
Hello, thank you, Professor Minzel and Professor Kwok and everyone for the interesting discussion. I'm a speech pathologist by training, so I'm one of those baddies that recommend putting in the tube sometimes. But in fact, especially in Hong Kong, like I work in a community too, there are times that, or very often, that when patients or families, even they may have expressed their wish or wishes to not have a tube, not eat, or any types of management, when for some sort of reasons they are rushed to a hospital for other things, there is so little time, and all resonates with me that the family seeing what's in front of them, they didn't have time to think, reflect, and the fast pace in the hospital, tubes is already in. So everything has gone against their wish, and by the time they're discharged, no one would ask the family whether that want to be taken out before they go. So very often in the community, they're left with a tube without knowing what to do and without having that kind of like knowledge and think they have the right to ask for that tube to be taken out. So I suppose that becomes one part of the dilemma where when we don't have enough or better communication with the family, written time, reflection, and all the changes over time when they were made, the advanced directives, when they thought about the cases. I remember one of my example was when I was seeing the same patient with Professor Kwok, where the family wished to remain on oral feeding. And when she came down a little bit, the family was very distressed and demanded for a tube feeding on the day that when she came see both of us. And then we both supported her not to put it in, and which took us quite a bit of time, a lot of tears in the session, hours of talking, and she left without a tube. Not sure whether she was happy, but at least she kept to what she wanted and what her mother wanted. But that was a tough decision for everyone to make at that time, and especially for us as clinicians. I remember rushing into Professor Kwok's office and say, what did you say to the patient? And what am I supposed to say? And what are we doing? Are we going to keep to the same decision we decided and to support the family? And at that time, we hope we're all doing the right thing. The family wanted to do the right thing, and I think that's a dilemma that we got stuck in.
Let me say here that I think I myself would be a very irresponsible, ethically irresponsible person if I wrote one of my perfect advance directives for refusing oral feed, did not have an appointed agent, because a directive without an agent is limp, and did not talk to my physician, who I thought would be the likely person to be overseeing at the time, and did not talk to my family that would be involved. Now, not all family are going to be involved. But if I don't do those three things, I'm not being responsible in writing my advance directive.
And I suppose the agent, at certain times, the agent sway too. So can they change it? At what point? And when you were asking that question, can they change it? At what point they can take it over if the patient decided on the advanced directives? Can the agent later change it? Or if the agent wrote that, can they change it? Or the when issue is very important. And what's
Speak to it in the directive is what we do in the complete directive. It's new. That very issue of when the agent judges you not to have sufficient.
People have a right to change their minds. Don't listen
That's
to
right.
this and say, no, you said back in 2012, and therefore, no, change your mind if you have enough of a mind to change.
I just have a quick thing to clarify with Professor Menzel. So you mentioned about MCF, right? So minimal comfort feeding. If it is written on the advanced directive, that's great. That would be ideal. But what if it's not written? Is it going with the not yet, just wait strategy? Is that a two-way strategy, or?
If you have an advance directive, yes, then you'd have another ambiguity in it. It's not in the directive. But the person who was the lead author, Hope Wetchkin, director of a hospice in Seattle, of this paper I mentioned that I was part of, she regards the minimum comfort feeding as potentially, it's going to take a little persuasion, but right in her own hospice, it is standard of care for people in advanced dementia already in some clinical settings, and not in many yet. But her hope, because the notion of minimum comfort feeding wasn't even in the literature until 3 months ago with this paper. So, and now a big project is emerging and talking with various clinical entities around the country, not just Washington State. So her view is, since it overcomes the then self, now self problem, because the patient is satisfied, it should be standard of care. Unless the person said ahead of time, or their agent says, when they do have an agent, and many don't, she wanted life to live as long as possible. If they said that, then don't do minimum comfort feeding, do comfort feeding only in advanced dementia. But if that's not the case, do minimum comfort feeding. It should be standard of care. I don't know whether she'll ever get to the day when that's the case, but that's her conviction.
That's basically aligned with what Professor Kwok was saying about reading their body language and behavioral response.
No, I think that my view is that Dr. Kwok is just doing good comfort feeding, not minimum comfort.
I see.
Comfort feeding means you don't do the things that he said the patient is indicating.
Okay. Okay, thanks for clarification. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Menzel and Professor Kwok. I think both Professor Menzel and Professor Kwok agree that we should respect the patients in severe dementia advance directive and let them pass away in a most comfortable and humane way to pass away, right? But however, different people in different culture could have different concept of comfort. Like, as Professor Kwok pointed out, that tube feeding is more comfortable than oral feeding in the context of Hong Kong or in Asian context. However, tube feeding could extend patients' life for several months or even years. So under this context, even the doctors are very want to honor patients' advance directive, but they believe tube feeding is the most humane way and most comfortable way. So it couldn't hasten patients' death. So the minimal comfort feeding will be inapplicable under this context.
Sorry, I didn't say that tube feeding is more comfortable than oral feeding. I'm saying that some people who are orally fed are not comfortable. So we should not be feeding them at all. In fact, I'll take reference of a private patient of mine. She's quite a clever lady in her 90s, and she never liked doctors. And she kept seeing me from time to time just to have a chat, but she never listened to me and had took any medication. And at the end, she was dying of cancer, but she refused all treatment. But she came to the hospital nevertheless because family was having difficulty looking after her. But she accepted nothing, not even a paracetamol tablet. But she did accept oral feeding from the family until the last day or two when she could not swallow anymore. So I told the family that it's cruel to feed her anymore because she's so uncomfortable. I think that's my point. Oral feeding, most people would accept, but except some people who do, really want to die. And there are some exceptional people who are too old, 100 years old, 100, purely because they're too old and they've had enough and just stop eating. So there are people like that. But even when we are trying to feed frail elderly people, when it becomes too uncomfortable, we should stop, and rather than causing problems and discomfort. Yeah.
Hello. I'm a GP in Australia. I'm the guy the patient came to see me when they start writing the Advanced Health Directive. And I'm the guy they turn to in the middle of the night, ringing me from the hospital, looking at that. Okay, so I find that it's difficult because writing the Advanced Health Directive would be years before they actually needed it. And I see that my job, as the Hippocratic Oath say, is for the benefit of the patient. And however, after time, the benefit of the patient will be changed because of time. And also, I find that being the family GP, benefit of the relatives and attitude of relatives and the cultural differences that all influence that word benefit to the patient. I find it been very difficult in my life in going through, navigating through this. The way I usually do it is, I use the benefit of being a doctor. I make the decision for you. Thank you.
That's what we do. And so it's a fallback. If somebody has not made advance directive, then we try to make do and try to do the best for the patients. But what we're talking about is that when people have indicated their wishes in advance directive, we should try to respect it. But then, if you make advance directive so detailed, I doubt if people would do it. Well, depending on the individuals, and because in a way you are giving away. It is a give and take. In order to protect yourself from these scenarios, you are giving away some opportunity of life. So there's trade-off to this, and
well, I think one of the ways that an advance directive loses ethical weight. It may not lose legal weight, but it loses ethical weight. For me, if I were the patient's agent, or if I'm a physician, is if it's just very old and hasn't been reiterated. Take Margot Bentley. She made her first directive in 1993. She was initially diagnosed with dementia in 2004. She wrote her latest directive in, I think, 2007. She got advanced dementia. She was in advanced dementia by 2011 and died in 2016. If she wrote her last advanced directive in 2006, say, and went into severe dementia and lost all cognitive capacity to revise her directive. Suppose she didn't reiterate a directive in 2007. She just had this original directive in 1993 and hadn't reiterated it for a full 15 years before she lost her decision-making capacity. I wouldn't trust the directive because I don't know what her views are.
But what about her daughter?
Yes, now in her case, she had a daughter who was conversing with her throughout this time. And that counts for a lot, with no other family members disputing the daughter's understanding of her mother's wishes. Yes. I mean, there are all kinds of circumstantial factors here. But clearly, as Bonnie and I thought when we worked through this 12, 15 years ago for a different paper, there are weak directives, and they can be weak for a variety of reasons. Even the strongest, most perfect advanced directive for withholding oral feeding, namely the one that I posted on that website there. If it's 15 years old and the person hasn't had any discussion of it since and hasn't reiterated it in writing, take me. I'm 82. People know my views on this. I have an advanced directive. Suppose I don't bother to change it. I'm still perfectly competent in decision-making capacity when I'm 92. And then I get an advanced dementia by 97, if I should live that long. And I haven't said a word about it since. I stopped writing about it. I didn't give any more talks about it. Bonnie doesn't remember me mentioning anything at breakfast.
I can't imagine. Don't
trust my directive. I think by my own default, I've handed the doctor and my agent and my family the decision.
So I want to echo one of the earlier comments by Professor Mensel about feeding people with advanced dementia. It's in fact a very skillful art itself. There are some people who are very, very skillful and be able to feed the person even they are quite advanced in the dementia. And in fact, I mean, when it comes back to the term comfort feeding, what does comfort mean? They don't have to be smiling, but they can eat and swallow. Is that still comfortable? And I think that's a question that we all sometimes may have. I mean, like, of course, when they're clearly distressed, turning their head away, pushing us away, that is definitely discomfort. We have to stop. But when a person is not smiling, but if you put a spoon in their mouth, they're not opening their mouth, but if you gently or not so gently shove it in and then they swallow, is that still comfort? And I think that makes it very difficult for carers to decide, and especially for family members. I suppose when they try shove it in, and when they shove it in every now and then, they don't have to swallow every spoonful. What about every third spoonful they swallow and the family may still want to feed? And I suppose the family would, we do have to respect what the family are doing. But when it comes down to the medical setting, I think that's very difficult for all of us to draw that line to, where is this, where is the discomfort coming in? And I think that's one of the most difficult things.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Mansell, Professor Kwok, and everyone for the engaging discussion. As we come to the end of this event, may I invite our Center Co-Director, Dr. Ann Lau, to give a closing remarks.
Thank you, Joey. Thank you, Professor Mansell, and also Professor Kwok, for your very inspiring talk, and also sharing the perspective, to these very complex and also difficult topics that basically affect every one of us. And this also basically align with the commitment of the center to integrate discussion and also consideration, ethical consideration into our medical education and also practice. Indeed, end-of-life care is only one of our 5+ topical pillars, as mentioned by Roger, that I truly invite all of you to really take a look to our yellow booklet, which shares that on top of that, we also have bioethics education, AI and emerging technologies, genetics and genomics, and also medical humanities. We have a plus to that is because we don't want to limit our discussions to just the 5 topics. And basically, these are topics that are ever evolving. So for colleagues and also friends who would like to have some thoughts to share with us, or also even collaborate with us, we are truly welcome all of you to approach us for a discussion. And with that, to close this event, before I close in, basically, I would also like to invite all of you to join our next event, which is also a part of our 10th anniversary ceremonial event, to be held next week, which is also about aging. The topic is, what do we have in common? Thinking together about good lives for older adults and also caregivers in aging societies, to be delivered by Dr. Nancy Berlinger. So Dr. Berlinger is a senior research scholar and also director of the Visiting Scholar Program, the Hastings Center of the United States. So the event will be held on next Monday, 3rd of March, from 3 to 4 p.m. at the same venue, that is this classroom. And so last but not least, we would like to thank you once again for every one of us for joining us, and also those participate on Zoom into this very meaningful discussion. And we would like to also take a chance to deliver the souvenir to Professor Mansell, for your very inspiring talk and also joining us in this very important milestone. Thank you, Professor Mansell. So Roger, please join me maybe.
Okay, all right. We need to take a picture.
It's basically reflecting, our campus, very signature architecture.
You're warning.
Yeah, we cannot pass through that. And also Professor Kwok.
I hope you don't have this yet.
It's a collection.